The air inside the Manhattan Supreme Courthouse didn't just feel still. It felt deliberate, like the building itself knew something was about to shift. The room carried the faint scent of expensive cologne layered over the older smells of wood polish and paper that had soaked into the walls for decades. At one table sat Alexander Prescott, a man whose face had been on the cover of Fortune more times than some world leaders. His navy suit was sharp, the watch on his wrist more valuable than some apartments in the city. But what stood out most was his expression, not nervousness, not even mild concern, but the kind of bored impatience of someone who believed the end of the game had already been decided. Opposite him, Elena Prescott sat in a simple dark dress. For the last 3 days, she'd spoken so little that even the court clerk seemed to have stopped expecting her to answer in more than a whisper. The lines on her face were not from age alone. They were the grooves left by years of bending to the will of a man who measured every interaction in terms of leverage. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked, to any casual observer, like a woman resigned to whatever the next 10 minutes would bring. The judge, Margaret Ellison, was nearing the end of a long week. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the final dissolution decree, and cleared her throat. "This court finds," she began. But the sentence never made it to the period. Because Elena moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a kind of controlled precision that drew every eye in the room. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a single folded document, pale blue against the darker leather. There was no tremor in her fingers. She rose, her voice cutting through the silence with a clarity she hadn't shown all week. "Your Honor, before you proceed, there is one document the court has not yet reviewed." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Even the scratch of the stenographer's keys slowed as Judge Ellison raised an eyebrow. At the defense table, Prescott's attorney, Martin Corbin, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "With respect, Your Honor, whatever my opponent has just pulled from her purse is irrelevant. We've all agreed no such document exists." Alexander Prescott didn't join in the laugh. He didn't even shift in his seat. His eyes locked on the paper in Elena's hands, and for the first time in days, something flickered across his face, recognition, followed instantly by a shadow of something colder. He knew that paper. He knew the texture, the faint watermark that could only be seen when it caught the light. And he knew it wasn't supposed to be here. He had burned it himself. 15 years ago, the night after their wedding. Judge Ellison gestured for the document. Elena walked toward the bench. The dress that had seemed so plain moments earlier now moved like armor, every step measured. She handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The room inhaled and held. It was no 100-page contract thick with corporate language. Just 5 pages, handwritten in parts, signed in 3 places. And there, in black ink, next to Alexander Prescott, was the signature he had been so certain would never surface again. Corbin broke the silence. "Your Honor, I renew my objection. This is an obvious fabrication. My client." "Mr. Corbin," the judge interrupted, her tone neutral but edged. "This document is dated April 18th, 2008. It bears your client's signature, as well as Mrs. Prescott's maiden name and the signature of a witness, one Harold Quinn." She looked up at Alexander. "Does that name sound familiar?" Prescott's jaw tightened. Quinn had been his right hand for a decade before quietly disappearing from the company's public history. Alexander didn't answer. The judge's eyes dropped back to the page. "Clause 4B, she read aloud, states that in the event of marital dissolution due to an act of profound personal betrayal, including, but not limited to, infidelity, all premarital assets remain with their original owner, except a 51% controlling interest in Prescott Tech, to be transferred to Ms. Marlowe." She looked at Alexander again. "That is unusual." Corbin tried to brush it off. "Boilerplate, Your Honor. My client was sole founder. Any reference to company equity is meaningless." "It continues," Ellison said, ignoring him. "The rationale being that this company was a partnership of vision, unlocked through joint support and sacrifice during the foundational years of the marriage." She looked back up, and for the first time her voice cooled. "That is not boilerplate." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Prescott Tech was not just an asset. It was the foundation of Alexander's empire, the company that had developed the logistics algorithm now used by most major shipping conglomerates. Handing over majority control would be like amputating the limb that held the rest of the body upright. Alexander stood abruptly. "This is a lie," he said, his voice rising. "She faked this. That is not my signature." "Sit down, Mr. Prescott," Ellison ordered sharply. For a moment, neither moved. Then he sat, the muscle in his jaw still twitching. Elena's lawyer, Robert Chun, spoke for the first time that day. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to authenticate both the signature and the circumstances under which this agreement was executed." Corbin scoffed. "We'll see about that." The judge nodded slowly. "We will. This hearing will recess for 1 week. Both parties will prepare to address the authenticity and enforceability of this document in full." And just like that, the opening salvo was over. But in that small exchange, the ground beneath Alexander Prescott had shifted in ways he hadn't yet calculated. He had entered the courthouse expecting to win by routine. Now, a single piece of paper had turned a clean victory into a war. As the gavel came down, Elena didn't look at her husband. She was looking ahead, at the next week, at the next fight, at the truth she had kept quietly, patiently, until the moment it would do the most damage. Because this wasn't just about a marriage ending. It was about how a man who built his life on controlling every variable had just been introduced to one he never saw coming. Before the courthouse silence, before the pale blue paper reappeared like a ghost, there was a different kind of story, one that unfolded quietly over years, away from the public eye. It began not with lawyers or contracts, but with two people who, at least in the beginning, believed they were building something together. Elena Marlowe was 28 the year she met Alexander Prescott. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Lower Manhattan, the scent of fresh bread creeping into her mornings. Most of her days were spent buried in research, working toward her doctorate in art history. Her world revolved around color palettes, provenance records, and the thrill of tracing a painting's journey through centuries. She had no interest in quarterly earnings reports or venture capital. To make ends meet, she worked part-time at a Soho gallery. It wasn't glamorous. She spent more hours cataloging backroom inventory than speaking with clients, but it allowed her to be near the art she loved. The gallery's visitors came in two types: genuine collectors and those who wanted the appearance of culture. She had learned to spot the difference in seconds. The night she met Prescott, the gallery was hosting a private showing for a handful of high-profile patrons. She'd seen his name on the guest list, but hadn't thought much of it. He was the kind of figure who appeared in business magazines with headlines about disruption and innovation, not someone she expected to speak to at length about brushstrokes and symbolism. He arrived without fanfare, no entourage, no publicist. He moved through the space like he owned it, not out of arrogance, but with the ease of someone used to being welcomed everywhere. While most guests clustered near the champagne, Prescott made a straight line toward Elena. She was mid-sentence with a potential buyer when he interrupted, not rudely, but with a kind of direct curiosity. "Tell me something the plaque doesn't," he said, nodding toward the painting she'd been describing. It wasn't the kind of question she was used to from wealthy visitors. She hesitated, then began telling him about a letter the artist had written to his brother the night the piece was finished, how the wilting flowers in the composition weren't meant to symbolize death, but the fleeting nature of joy. Prescott listened, really listened, for nearly an hour. He didn't glance at his phone or scan the room for someone more important. His attention felt like a light trained entirely on her. From that moment, the tempo of their relationship was set, fast, intense, almost cinematic. Within weeks, she was being flown to Martha's Vineyard for dinner, taken on a surprise trip to Paris, given after-hours tours of museums she'd only ever dreamed of visiting. Prescott seemed fascinated by her mind, by the fact that she lived in a world so different from his own. He told her she was unlike the women he usually met in his circles, that she wasn't chasing status or leverage. He called her my still point in a turning world. For someone who had spent most of her adult life on the academic fringe of New York society, it was a heady thing to be chosen by a man who could have anyone. Her friends, though, were less enchanted. Samantha Hale, her closest friend from graduate school, was blunt in her warnings. "Men like that don't stop being sharks because they've found a dolphin," she told Elena over coffee. Elena laughed it off. It felt cynical, maybe even a little jealous. For over a year, the relationship seemed charmed. Prescott was generous, attentive, and made her feel like a partner in his life. But as the wedding approached, the tone shifted. 1 month before the ceremony, Prescott brought up the idea of a prenuptial agreement. He framed it as a standard precaution, just responsible estate planning. The first draft, prepared by his lawyers, was cold enough to chill a room. It stripped Elena of any significant claim on the fortune they might build together. She would receive a lump sum, large by ordinary standards, but a fraction of what Prescott Tech was worth even then. When she showed it to Samantha, the reaction was instant and sharp. "This isn't a prenup. It's an exit strategy." His exit strategy. "You're signing your life away." Elena confronted Prescott. She told him she didn't want his past wealth, but she also didn't want to feel like an employee whose severance had been calculated before she'd even started. She spoke about partnership, about building a life together where both contributed, even if their contributions were different. Prescott didn't argue. He listened, and then, in what felt like a deeply personal gesture, he agreed. "You're right," he told her. "This doesn't reflect us." He went to his desk and took out a sheet of his personal stationery, pale blue, with a faint watermark. "Forget the lawyers," he said. "Let's make our own promise." The document they created together was only 5 pages. It acknowledged that his premarital assets would remain his, but it also contained a clause unlike anything Elena had ever seen. Clause 4b. If the marriage ended due to an act of profound personal betrayal, including infidelity, a controlling 51% interest in Prescott Tech would be transferred to her. Prescott said it was about trust, about putting something real and meaningful in writing. He insisted on having Harold Quinn, his longtime mentor and trusted advisor, sign as a witness. They made 2 copies. "One for you, one for me," he said. The next night, in their new home, Prescott poured 2 glasses of vintage scotch, held up his copy, and said, "To our promise." Then, without hesitation, he threw it into the fireplace. Elena told herself it was symbolic, that they would never need the paper because their marriage would never come to that. What she didn't know was that it wasn't romance. It was strategy. Prescott believed hers was the only surviving copy, and that, in time, she'd misplace it. For 15 years, the marriage played out in public as a success. 2 children, charity galas, carefully curated photographs in society pages. Behind the scenes, Elena's life narrowed. Her work in art history faded into the background. Her role became that of a hostess, a mother, a quiet fixture at Prescott's side. The paper stayed hidden, preserved in the same safe place she'd chosen on the day they signed it. She didn't take it out. She didn't even reread it. But she remembered every word. When the divorce petition came, it was efficient and bloodless. Prescott assumed the old corporate prenup his lawyers had prepared years ago would close the matter. He never imagined that the pale blue document would survive, let alone that it would resurface in a courtroom, intact and ready to detonate the foundation of his empire. That assumption was the first mistake in what would become the most dangerous miscalculation of his life. The first real shot in the war wasn't fired in that Manhattan courtroom. It came later, after the recess was called, after the clerk's gavel signaled the room could exhale. The moment the judge announced a 1-week delay to verify the document, the battle lines were drawn in ways neither side would walk back from. Alexander Prescott didn't even look at Elena when the judge adjourned. He rose, turned sharply, and strode toward the heavy courthouse doors with the kind of precision that suggested his mind was already 5 moves ahead. His legal team fell in around him like a security detail. He had built his fortune on the idea that any problem could be solved with the right combination of pressure, resources, and control. This was no different. The phone was already in his hand as the courthouse steps echoed under his shoes. "Give me everything," he said into it. "I want her life picked apart piece by piece. Every credit card, every conversation, every person she's had coffee with in the last 10 years. Start with the A-team." The A-team wasn't a term his lawyers used in public. It was his private name for a network of investigators whose reputations were as sharp as their invoices, specialists in manufacturing scandal when reality proved too uncooperative. For Prescott, truth was elastic. With enough money, it could be stretched into any shape he needed. Inside, Elena didn't rush. She gathered her things methodically, her pale blue document now back in her possession. Robert Chin walked beside her, silent until they reached the quieter hallway outside. They'll come after it from two angles, Chin said. The signature and the witness. Elena nodded. Harold Quinn. He's the only living person besides you and Prescott who can confirm the signing. Which means they'll find him before we do, and they'll make sure he never sees the inside of a courtroom. She remembered Quinn. A quiet man, more mentor than employee. Prescott had told her, years ago, that Quinn had been pushed out after a series of bad investment decisions. She hadn't questioned it at the time. Now, in the cold light of their divorce, the story felt like another piece of crafted fiction. That evening, as rain tapped against the windows of the small townhouse she'd rented after leaving their marital home, Elena sat at her kitchen table. The pale blue document lay in front of her, its folded edges soft from years of careful storage. She didn't touch it. She just stared at it, knowing that its survival was the only reason she had any leverage left. Her children were staying with her parents for the week, away from the noise that was about to descend. But she knew it wouldn't last. Scandal has a way of finding its way into even the most insulated corners, especially when someone as powerful as Alexander Prescott is determined to spread it. 2 days later, the first shot landed. A tabloid notorious for laundering reputations and destroying them in equal measure ran a headline across its front page. Billionaire's wife in forgery scandal, secret affair with younger man. The article claimed Elena had conspired to forge a prenuptial agreement after learning her husband intended to leave her. It suggested she was motivated by greed, fueled by resentment, and emboldened by an ongoing relationship with a younger man. The man in question was her cousin, captured in grainy telephoto images as they shared lunch at a midtown cafe. The truth, that he was family, was omitted. Anonymous sources, conveniently close to the Prescott household, described her as unstable and erratic. They spoke of extravagant spending in recent months, painting her as a woman spiraling out of control. By that afternoon, her phone was vibrating with messages she didn't want to read. Parents from her children's school expressed concern. Old friends sent carefully worded texts that felt more like inquiries than support. Even some of the charities she'd worked with for years issued polite but firm statements distancing themselves from the ongoing matter. Elena read none of it after the first few lines. She pushed the phone aside, but the knot in her chest remained. That night, Robertson called. His voice was calm, steady. It's textbook. Discredit you in the court of public opinion before you ever step back into a court of law. Don't engage. Don't respond. They're using our children, she said quietly. They're turning our friends against me. You knew they would. Now you need to focus. They'll try to destroy the document by discrediting the signature and silencing the witness. If we can secure Harold Quinn before they do, we have a fighting chance. Quinn, however, had been erased as thoroughly as if Prescott had commissioned the job years in advance. There was no phone listing, no social media presence. The company's archives no longer mentioned him. Chun hired a private investigator named Frank Dwyer, a retired detective with a reputation for being both discreet and relentless. If Quinn was out there, Frank would find him. But Prescott's next move wasn't aimed at Quinn. It was aimed directly at Elena. 3 days after the tabloid hit, a courier arrived at her door with an envelope bearing the letterhead of Prescott's legal team. Inside was a motion for an emergency custody hearing. Prescott was petitioning for sole custody of their 2 children, citing her unstable behavior and documented attempts to commit fraud. As evidence, she posed a danger to their well-being. The pale blue prenup was Exhibit A. She read the document twice, then a third time, before setting it down. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The threat was no longer abstract. This wasn't about headlines or reputation. This was about losing her children. The fear was so sharp it felt physical, like ice spreading from her chest outward. She curled into the corner of her sofa, the legal notice still in her hand. That was how Samantha found her, hours later, still sitting in the same position. Samantha didn't waste words. This is what he wants. He wants you to break. He wants you to beg for terms that give him everything. The company, the narrative, the kids. You give in now, he'll give you just enough to keep breathing and take everything else. I can't fight him, Elena whispered. Not like this. Yes, you can, Samantha said. Her voice was steel-wrapped in compassion. You've already landed the first blow. Now you keep going. Find Quinn. Prove the signature. And when he tries to take your children, make sure the court sees who he really is. It was the moment the fear hardened into something else. Not hope, Not yet, but a resolve that wasn't there before. The week between hearings was no longer just preparation for court. It was preparation for war. Frank Dwyer's first report arrived 2 days after Prescott's custody filing. It was short, and it wasn't the news Elena had hoped for. "Quinn's a ghost," Frank said over speakerphone in Chin's office. "No current address. No recent employment history. No credit activity. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone paid to erase him from the grid." "Prescott," Chin said simply. Frank didn't disagree. "I did find a property transfer from 2008. A 5-acre plot up in Sullivan County. Gifted from Prescott Tech to Harold Quinn. It's undeveloped land, but a neighbor says Quinn built himself a cabin there. Lives off the grid, or at least he used to." "That could be him," Elena said. "Prescott told me once it was Quinn's sanctuary. A place he'd disappear to when the corporate world got too loud." Frank agreed to drive up the next morning. He promised to be discreet. No knocking on doors unless he was sure Quinn was inside. But the call he made from the road the following day told a different story. "He was here," Frank said. "Or someone was. The cabin's empty now. Coffee pot still warm when I got in. There's mail from the last few days, but no sign of Quinn. Neighbor says a black SUV with tinted windows sat at the end of the driveway for hours yesterday. Left just before dark." Elena didn't need Frank to tell her whose SUV it was. Prescott had beaten them there. "Threaten him, pay him off, probably both," Chin muttered. "Even if we find him now, Prescott's lawyers will claim we coerced him. His credibility is gone." For Elena, it was the first real blow since the pale blue paper had left her safe. Without Quinn, the battle over authenticity became a duel between handwriting experts, and Prescott had the resources to bury her in conflicting reports. That night, she couldn't sleep. Boxes she still hadn't unpacked from her old life sat in the corner of her rented living room. On impulse, she began sorting through them. It was a slow excavation: photo albums, old invitations, remnants of a life she no longer recognized. Near the bottom of one box, she found a leather folio she hadn't opened in years. Inside were letters from her academic days, correspondence with museums, drafts of research papers. And in the middle of them, an envelope made of pale blue stationery. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't the prenup. It was a letter from Prescott, dated 3 months before their wedding. A formal donation pledge to the Soho Gallery where she had worked, funding a research fellowship in her name. He had written it on the exact same pale blue stationery they had used for the prenup. The stationery he now claimed was reserved for personal, non-binding notes. At the bottom was his signature, identical to the one on the prenup. But the real weight of the letter wasn't the ink. It was the gallery's official reply, which she also still had. It thanked him for his legally binding pledge and referenced his letter by date. That acknowledgement, on the gallery's letterhead, meant that Prescott had used the pale blue stationery for a binding legal and financial commitment. When she called Chin to tell him, his voice carried a new sharpness. "That's not just a signature match. That's a paper match. It destroys his argument that the prenup was an informal, meaningless document." The find shifted the energy in Chin's office. For the first time since the tabloid hit, Elena felt the current flowing back in her direction. But Chin wasn't finished. "We can prove the prenup is binding," he said. "But Prescott will pivot. He'll accept the document exists, then argue the betrayal clause hasn't been triggered. He'll accuse you of being the unfaithful one. That's what he's been setting up with the tabloid," Elena said. "Exactly. Which is why we're not going to stop at Clause 4B. He pulled out a copy of the prenup and slid it across the table. "There's something you overlooked, an addendum, handwritten by Prescott himself." Elena leaned over the page. The addendum described a private trust, the Phoenix Trust, to be administered by a third party. In the event of divorce, control would pass to her, but only if Prescott had fulfilled certain pre-existing personal obligations. Chin explained what Frank's latest dig had uncovered. Those obligations? A child. A son, born a year before you met him. The trust exists to provide for the boy and his mother, on the condition of their absolute silence. Elena's hands tightened on the paper. The betrayal felt deeper than any she had imagined. Chin went on. "Her name is Catherine Powell. She lives in Connecticut. Payments from the trust stopped 2 months ago, right when Prescott decided to divorce you. My guess? He was cutting loose ends." By the next morning, Elena and Chun were driving north, away from the city. Catherine's home was modest, tidy, lined with bookshelves and art supplies. Photographs of a dark-haired teenager were everywhere. His eyes, Elena noticed immediately, were Prescott's. Catherine didn't waste time with pleasantries. He served me with a new NDA. Said if I didn't sign, the trust payments would end. When I refused, he cut me off. He threatened to take my son. The same son he's seen 5 times in 16 years. Elena told her about the prenup clause. Catherine's expression changed, surprise, then something like grim amusement. So the man who spent years keeping us apart has now legally bound our futures together. Poetic. They talked for hours. Catherine agreed to testify, not as a hostile witness under subpoena, but willingly, as someone who had her own truth to tell. She had letters she'd written to her son, a single photograph of Prescott holding him as a baby, and the original trust documents. As Elena and Chun drove back to the city, she felt the shape of the coming battle changing. Prescott thought he was fighting a legal technicality. What he would face instead was the combined weight of 2 women whose lives he had tried to control and discard. In the courtroom, that kind of alliance could be fatal. The second hearing began in a courtroom charged with a different kind of energy. Reporters were out in greater numbers. Prescott's legal team arrived with the air of men expecting a swift victory. Elena noticed that Martin Corbin, Prescott's lead attorney, wore the faint smile of someone who believed the narrative was firmly under his control. Prescott himself looked relaxed, the kind of relaxed that came from knowing you had paid for every advantage money could buy. He'd spent the week flooding the court with expert reports. The most prominent came from a nationally known handwriting analyst who declared, with 99% certainty, that the signature on the pale blue prenup was a masterful but artificial reproduction. Alongside it was a sworn affidavit from Harold Quinn, stating he had never witnessed the execution of such a document. Elena didn't look at Prescott as she took her seat. She didn't need to. She could feel his confidence radiating across the aisle. When the judge entered, Corbin wasted no time. His voice carried the rehearsed conviction of a man building a performance. Your Honor, what we have here is a fabrication. My client has been generous and patient, but Mrs. Prescott's continued attempts to defraud him have forced us to defend not just his assets, but his reputation. The evidence is irrefutable. The signature is fake. The witness denies involvement. There is no case here, only an attempt to weaponize falsehood. Judge Ellison listened without expression. When Corbin finished, she turned to Robert Chun. Mr. Chun. Chun stood, calm and unhurried. Your Honor, we are not here to debate the authenticity of my client's signature. We are here to prove it. He opened his briefcase and produced 2 documents, each sealed in protective evidence sleeves. Exhibit B, a letter written by Mr. Prescott on April 18, 2008, 3 months before the prenup, written on the exact same pale blue stationery. In this letter, he pledges a substantial donation to the Soho Gallery where my client was employed. He placed the letter on the clerk's desk. Exhibit C, the gallery's official acknowledgement, on letterhead, thanking him for his legally binding pledge and explicitly referencing the letter by date. Chin's voice didn't rise, but each word landed like a hammer. Mr. Prescott's central argument against this prenup is that the document was informal, written on stationery he reserved for personal use. These exhibits prove otherwise. He has used this paper for formal, binding financial commitments. The room shifted. Even the reporters in the back began scribbling faster. Prescott's composure flickered for the first time. Corbin jumped to his feet. Objection. Relevance. Overruled, Judge Ellison said, her eyes never leaving the exhibits. Chun continued. Your Honor, these documents authenticate not just the signature, but the medium itself. Mr. Prescott cannot claim this paper is meaningless when he has used it to bind himself legally in other matters. His own history contradicts his defense. It was the first crack in Prescott's armor, and Elena could see it. He was staring at the letter, as though trying to remember how it had escaped his control. But Chin wasn't finished. Your Honor, while Clause 4B regarding infidelity has drawn the most attention, we asked the court to turn to Addendum 2, handwritten by Mr. Prescott himself. This clause establishes the Phoenix Trust to be controlled by Mrs. Prescott in the event of divorce, provided certain pre-existing personal obligations have been met. Corbin frowned, caught off guard. This is irrelevant to the matter at hand. On the contrary, Chin said smoothly. Those obligations refer to the financial provision for a child born prior to the marriage, a child Mr. Prescott has kept hidden from public knowledge for 16 years. The air in the courtroom tightened. Even Judge Ellison's pen stilled over her notes. Chin went on. We will demonstrate that the Phoenix Trust was created to provide for this child and his mother, Catherine Powell. Payments ceased 2 months ago, coinciding with Mr. Prescott's decision to divorce my client. This action violates the very clause he wrote into his own agreement. The judge leaned forward. Do you have a witness? Chin allowed the pause to work in his favor. We do, Your Honor. The defense may not recognize her name, but my client assures me Mr. Prescott will. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Catherine Powell walked in with steady steps, dressed plainly, her dark curls pulled back. She didn't glance at Prescott, but the moment he saw her, the color drained from his face. Corbin half rose from his seat. Your Honor, we object to. Overruled, Ellison said. Proceed. Catherine took the stand. Chin's first question was simple. Miss Powell, could you state your relationship to the defendant? Her voice was clear. He is the father of my son. The reaction was immediate. A ripple through the gallery, pins scratching furiously. Catherine testified about the trust, the NDA, the years of enforced silence. She produced the original trust documents, the single photograph of Prescott holding his infant son, and copies of the letters she had written to the boy but never sent. Chun presented each piece methodically, never raising his voice, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. The narrative Prescott had so carefully crafted, of a wronged husband defending himself against a greedy spouse, began to unravel in real time. Judge Ellison's face hardened as the testimony continued. When Catherine stepped down, the judge looked directly at Prescott. This court finds the prenuptial agreement authentic and binding. The testimony and exhibits prove a pattern of deceit that meets the definition of profound personal betrayal, as stipulated in Clause 4B. Accordingly, control of Prescott Tech, at 51%, will be transferred to Mrs. Prescott, as will full control of the Phoenix Trust. The gavel came down like a closing door. Prescott sat frozen, his empire reduced in a single sentence. Elena rose, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. She passed Prescott without a glance and walked toward Catherine. The two women exchanged a look, not of victory, but of solidarity. The war was over, and they had both survived it. The gavel's final strike seemed to hang in the air longer than the sound itself. It was as if the whole room needed a beat to process what had just happened. Judge Ellison gathered her papers in silence, the bailiff's voice calling the next case already fading into background noise. Alexander Prescott didn't move. His lawyers spoke in low, urgent tones, but he kept staring at the polished surface of the defense table as if it might offer an escape. The weight of the judgment had not just stripped him of control over Prescott Tech and the Phoenix Trust. It had exposed him in a way he had spent decades avoiding. Elena didn't watch him for long. She rose, collected her bag, and turned toward the aisle. Catherine was already standing, waiting near the benches. When their eyes met, it wasn't victory they shared. It was something quieter, heavier, a recognition of the cost. They walked out together, side by side, into the marble hallway where reporters were already gathering. Cameras flashed. Questions overlapped. Chin stepped forward, using his frame as a shield, and guided them toward the elevators without a single comment. Inside the elevator, the three of them stood in silence. The air felt oddly still, as if the building itself was catching its breath. You realize, Catherine said softly, this isn't the end for him. I know, Elena replied. But it's the first time he's ever had to answer to someone he couldn't control. When they reached the lobby, the crowd outside was waiting. Security had cordoned off a narrow path to the street, but microphones still pushed forward, questions firing like small-caliber rounds. Mrs. Prescott, is it true? Catherine, will you? Alexander, are you going to appeal? Prescott had chosen a different exit. Elena didn't see him again that day. Back at Chin's office, the mood was calmer but no less intense. The judgment meant that effective immediately, Elena was majority owner of Prescott Tech. Control of the Phoenix Trust was also hers, with full authority to oversee the financial future of Catherine's son. I'll have corporate counsel meet with you tomorrow, Chin said, sliding a thick packet across the desk. They'll walk you through what 51% means in terms of governance. You don't have to make operational changes right away, but you will have voting control on the board. Elena didn't touch the packet. She stared at it, her mind still in the courtroom. Robert, I'm not sure I want to run his company. You don't have to, he said. You just have to make sure he can't use it to hurt people anymore. Catherine leaned back in her chair. And the trust? That's simpler, Chen said. The assets are intact. Payments to you and your son will resume immediately, retroactive to when he stopped them. He can't interfere without violating a court order. And after today, I don't think the judge will tolerate a single misstep. Elena finally looked at Catherine. You said before you didn't want his money. You wanted his name for Leo. That's something we can work on. But I want you to understand, this trust is more than a payout. It's leverage. And leverage is what he's always used against people. We can turn it into protection. Catherine nodded slowly. Then we'll protect each other. That night, Elena sat alone in her townhouse. The house was quiet, the children still with her parents until the weekend. She poured herself a glass of wine and opened the leather folio where the pale blue prenup had lived for so many years. The paper was still crisp, the ink unfaded. She traced her finger lightly over the words, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder, a record of the promise that had begun as a gesture of love and ended as a weapon of survival. Her phone buzzed. A text from Samantha. You did it. Elena typed back. We did it. She set the phone down and let herself think, really think, about what had happened. The fight hadn't just been about money or even about winning. It had been about refusing to let him control the narrative one more time. For years, she'd played her role in his carefully staged life. Now, she had rewritten the ending. The next morning brought the inevitable. News outlets ran the story across every platform. Billionaire loses majority stake in tech empire after secret child revealed. Court awards control of Prescott Tech to ex-wife in stunning divorce judgment. The coverage was relentless. Some painted it as a morality tale, others as a power play. There were debates on talk shows about prenups, about betrayal, about whether personal conduct should influence corporate control. Prescott's PR team released a statement within hours, calling the judgment deeply flawed and announcing plans to appeal. But the damage was done. Share prices dipped. Board members began distancing themselves. Business partners suddenly remembered ethics clauses in their contracts. Elena ignored most of it. She spent the morning with corporate counsel, learning the mechanics of her new position. The boardroom felt strange. The same room where Prescott had once hosted her as a silent spouse, now with her at the head of the table. She didn't make sweeping changes that day. Instead, she listened. She asked questions. She made it clear that she wasn't there to tear the company down, but to make sure it lived up to the ideals it had once been built on. 2 weeks later, she met with Catherine again, this time in the offices of the trust's administrator. They reviewed the accounts, the terms, and the future. Catherine's son, Leo, didn't attend, but his presence was felt in every decision they made. We're going to restructure this, Elena said. It's not just going to be a pipeline of money. It's going to fund education, opportunities, protections, for him, and for anyone else Prescott has tried to bury. Catherine smiled faintly. You're turning his cage into a shelter. Exactly, Elena said. Prescott's appeal moved forward in the background, but without the element of surprise, his case was weaker. Every step of the process brought more public scrutiny, and with it, more risk for him. Whispers began to circulate about other NDAs, other secrets. For Elena, the legal fight became just one part of a larger mission. She kept a low profile, avoiding interviews, focusing on her children, on stabilizing the company, on building something in place of what Prescott had tried to destroy. The pale blue paper stayed in her possession, locked away again, not because she needed it now, but because it was proof that the truth, once buried, could still surface at the right moment and change everything. One rainy evening, months after the judgment, Elena received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single chess piece, a white queen, and a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. In the end, you outplayed him. She placed the piece on a shelf in her study. It didn't matter who had sent it. She knew what it meant. In the quiet that followed, she thought about what Catherine had said in the courthouse hallway. This isn't the end for him. She knew it was true. People like Prescott didn't disappear. They regrouped, they plotted, they came back in different forms. But now, he would always have to contend with the fact that there were people who had stood against him and won. Not because they were stronger in resources, but because they had been willing to hold the line when it mattered most. And that was something he couldn't erase, no matter how many files he deleted, how many names he scrubbed from the record. In the years to come, people would tell the story in different ways. Some would focus on the courtroom drama, others on the corporate upheaval. But the version Elena carried was simpler. It was the story of how a single piece of paper, kept safe for 15 years, became the turning point in a battle between control and truth. It was the story of how two women, strangers to each other, found themselves connected by betrayal, and how that connection became the thing that ended a man's untouchable reign. And it was a reminder, etched into her memory as sharply as the ink on that pale blue page, that even the most carefully built empires could be brought down, not always by force, but by the quiet persistence of those who refuse to forget. Some stories end when the verdict is read, when the gavel falls, when the courtroom empties. But the truth is, real stories, the ones that cut deep, don't end there. They linger. They echo in the spaces between headlines, in the quiet moments when the noise has faded but the consequences are still unfolding. For Alexander Prescott, the judgment was a public fall from grace. For the first time in his career, he was forced to cede control, not because of market forces or corporate rivals, but because of the very clauses he had once believed would protect him. Behind the closed doors of boardrooms he no longer dominated. Deals he would have orchestrated moved forward without his voice. He was still wealthy, still connected, but something fundamental had shifted. The illusion of invincibility was gone. For Catherine Powell, the judgment meant more than financial stability. It meant her son's story no longer had to be written in the shadows. The Phoenix Trust became not just a lifeline, but a platform, a way to ensure Leo would grow up knowing the truth, with the option to claim the name that had been hidden from him for 16 years. And for Elena Prescott, the victory was both liberation and responsibility. She didn't just walk away from a marriage. She stepped into the role of majority owner of Prescott Tech, a position she had never sought, but now held with deliberate intent. Her focus wasn't revenge. It was reform. She began reviewing contracts, meeting employees far below the executive tier, asking questions that had long gone unanswered. It was as if she was sifting through the DNA of the company, separating what was worth keeping from what had been built on intimidation and control. But the true resolution wasn't written in board minutes or trust fund statements. It was in the smaller, quieter changes. It was in the way her children laughed more freely at her parents' kitchen table, no longer bracing for the weight of their father's moods. It was in the email from a former Prescott Tech employee, thanking her for holding him accountable for practices they had once been too afraid to question. It was in the text she received from Catherine one night, a photo of Leo studying for his driver's test, with the caption, "He's finally talking about college." The pale blue document returned to the safe where it had lived for 15 years. But now it was more than leverage. It was proof that truth can survive long enough to be heard, even when someone with unlimited resources is trying to bury it. People asked her if she'd do it all again, knowing the personal cost. She never answered directly. Some battles aren't about whether you'd fight them again. They're about the fact that you fought them at all. In the years ahead, Prescott's name would appear in the news in smaller, less flattering ways. A failed appeal here. A business venture gone cold there. But none of it carried the same force as the day the court stripped away his control, exposing the core of who he was. And while the world moved on, in certain circles the story of the pale blue paper became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed defenses can crumble, not from brute force, but from the patient precision of someone who refuses to forget. Because in the end, this wasn't just a legal victory. It was a lesson in endurance. It was the story of how betrayal, when met with persistence and the right moment, can be turned back on itself. And maybe, just maybe, it was proof that the quietest person in the room isn't the one with the least power. Sometimes, they're just waiting for the perfect time to speak. If you've followed this case to the end, you've seen how the smallest details, a piece of paper, a forgotten clause, can shift the balance in a fight that seems impossible to win. It's a reminder that truth has its own kind of patience, and when the moment comes, it can cut deeper than any strategy. What do you think? Was justice truly served, Or did this story leave you with more questions? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, real stories of deception, resilience, and the fight for accountability, share this video and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most shocking stories are the ones that are true.